Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, welcome to the Global Boardroom. It's great to have you with us. Perhaps more than any other leader, you've spent the last 4 years walking a tightrope between trying to represent your values and trying not to provoke President Trump. So let me start by asking you, because this is very hot news still, do you feel relieved?
My job is to work with whoever gets elected in the United States. Over the past 4 years, we were able to renew our most important trade agreement in saving the North American Free Trade Agreement and making sure it was updated and modernized, even with an American president who is still a little bit unpredictable and protectionistic. I look forward to being able to talk with the new president much more about climate change, much more about some of our priorities. But my job is to work with whomever Americans elect, and we've been able to do it for the past 4 years. We will continue to do it for the coming years.
I think you were the first foreign leader who spoke to President-elect Biden. What did you talk about? And to what extent do you think that the change of president is going to help revive or reinforce what we call the Western liberal order?
Well, first of all, we talked mostly about COVID, the challenge that our countries and our world is facing right now. That is the most important thing to deal with. I mean, we all, and both Joe and I have talked many times about building back better as being a big goal for all of us, but we don't get to do that unless we make it through this pandemic. And that's really been my focus. And I think he's demonstrated that that's very much his focus as he's president-elect right now, as of after January 20. That's what he's going to be acting on. There's lots of other things for us to do as well on multilateralism, on fighting climate change, on creating good jobs in a transforming economy. These are things that Canada and the U.S. have always had a good relationship on, and we're going to keep working together on.
I want to get to the pandemic and the way that Canada addressed it, but one last question about the U.S. election. Do you have any concern about a peaceful transition of power in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think we should all and can all have confidence in the U.S. electoral processes. I think the temptation to opine and weigh in is certainly there around the world, who do feel like they have a certain stake in the American election, but it is not for us to comment or recommend, or it is us simply to trust that the American people and the American institutions will make it through strong.
Let's get to COVID. Compared to other major economies, your approach to pandemic relief has been amongst the most generous in terms of spending. It's also reported that you're going to add permanently to social and environmental programs rather than just leaving it as emergency spending. What is the right place to put extra public money during the recovery?
Well, I think starting with first things first, when the pandemic hit, we looked around and saw what some other countries were starting to do. And we realized that the best way to get through this was to be there for Canadians. So we decided we were going to do whatever it took for as long as it took to support Canadians. And we could do that because we came into it with one of the best balance sheets in the G7, really low debt to GDP ratio, strong financial footing. We had room for a buffer for a rainy day, and it was raining, it was pouring with COVID. So we stepped up and we delivered almost immediately, within weeks, a direct emergency an emergency response benefit that was $500 a week that went out to over 8 million people. A third of our, well over a third of our almost a third of our population. No, sorry, a quarter of our population. And it made a really, really big difference in supporting people in a really meaningful way. We moved forward with a wage subsidy at 75% for all businesses that had been down a little bit. And we brought in an emergency business account that gave a $60,000 loan, interest-free, $20,000 of it, which is totally forgivable. So what we did was we injected a lot of money into the economy so people could hunker down and get that first wave under control. So businesses could close and know they were going to be okay. And that really, really made a difference from the very beginning. And we've kept it going. So understanding that in this pandemic, people are going to have to take on debt. Well, somebody's going to have to pay for it. Either it's individuals, it's businesses. But we said, you know what? The government's going to take on the debt because we've got the best credit rating. We can borrow at the lowest cost. For us to take on debt so Canadians didn't have to, was the way to see us through, both on the health side and on the economic side.
And you
So
anticipated a second wave, essentially. You kept the support going, knowing that you may very well get a second wave.
Yeah, this summer we refined the tools we had, and our finance minister Chrystia Freeland was really important in this, refining the tools we had.
You remember very well at the FT.
Yes, I know. She remembers you all fondly. But the way we were looking at it, we said, okay, we'll refine the programs so that they'll automatically adjust. So if we go into a second wave, they'll get bigger. If companies need them more, they'll get bigger. If they need them less, they'll be smaller. But it's an automatic stabilizer. And we projected it out until next summer, and we'll see how that goes. But being able to do that gave people confidence, gave a level of stability, and has allowed us to do better.
It gave business a sense of certainty so that they can also plan ahead.
They knew we were going to be there. A lot of people were saying, well, should I close down? Should I just give up? Should I rehire people? And when we said, you do what you need to do, and we will be there regardless of how things happen. So we took that uncertainty of, if things go down again and we reopened, we're going to be in big trouble if the government doesn't help us. We'll be there. We'll help you. Because at the beginning, it was interesting because people sort of say, in order to protect ourselves from this health pandemic, we're going to have to really hurt our economy. But what we began to see through the summer and into the fall was actually dealing with the health crisis is the best way to protect the economy, to get people to stay home, to get people to close down, to limit their activities. And to have them hold in confidence means that once we're through this, once we have those vaccines, we're going to be able to start up again without having to rebuild from rubble and from shuttered main streets. And that decision was absolutely key.
Let's talk about the other side of this, which is the cost. The current estimate for the budget deficit in 2020 is about $380 billion. I think there's a consensus that emergency spending was necessary. No one would dispute that. But you also have not put any fiscal limits in place. Do you think that's giving business confidence? It certainly is. But how are you going to pay for it in the long term?
Well, first of all, let's remember where we are right now with historically low interest rates that mean that, even with, as you say, a $300 billion neighborhood for our deficit this year, last year was around $20 billion, so massively different. We're actually paying less in our debt servicing costs this year in 2020 than we did in 2019 because of the way we're managing our long-term debt and the low interest rates. So we can afford it. And of course, the counter argument is we can't afford not to. If we didn't take on this debt, then individuals would be putting it on their credit cards. Then businesses would be stacking up their level of indebtedness, and that would slow our recovery. But even more so, this is one-time expenditures. We're being very, very careful. And that sort of goes counter to something that you said earlier on, that we are not adding to our long-term debt or our long-term fiscal track. We know we have to return to responsibility. These are one-time costs that we have to invest in now to get Canadians through it. But afterwards, absolutely, we have to have a fiscal anchor. Absolutely, we need to be responsible in our spending and get ourselves back to a place of responsibility. That's what Canadians expect. That's what the world expects. And that's what we're going to do. But as we think about what that building back better looks like, there's lots of lessons we can bring in that don't automatically mean to more structural investments, structural deficits.
You talk about lessons that you've learned. What would you say are the two most important lessons that you've learned through this pandemic?
First of all, that you can't take care of the economy without taking care of people. And one of the things that we've seen is that the gaps that have always existed in our social fabric and our safety net, the most vulnerable people have all been exposed and deepened because of this crisis. And if we want to move forward and really be strong and prosperous, we're going to have to fix those. Move forward on things like better childcare. We have good childcare in Canada, but we need to do better, because it's not just a social goal to make sure that women can participate fully in the workforce. It's also a powerful economic lever and multiplier in terms of our success. Looking at the barriers, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion through this crisis around anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism that we're dealing with here in Canada. We have to go at some of those systemic inequalities and look at the intersectionalities and barriers that so many people are facing and say, okay, this is a moment where we need everyone to succeed. We need to bring everyone together. So how you build a strong economy isn't just how you're going to support the small few who are creating tremendous amounts of wealth. It's how you make sure that everyone can participate in that with a very pragmatic, not an idealistic or ideological approach to that, just saying we succeed when everyone has a chance to succeed. And that's more important now than ever before.
You funded a wage increase for key workers, especially in care homes. And presumably, that's not going to go back to pre-pandemic levels. But more broadly, how do you want to see the labor market change after the pandemic? And what do you see as the role of the government?
Well, I think, first of all, the labor market is absolutely going to change. I mean, this pandemic is different from the '08 recession, different from all other recessions. I mean, it's much more service-oriented. It's much more of a she-session than ever before. Women are more impacted. Young people, new Canadians more impacted. And that's something that we have to really understand and go at. But the economy was already changing to being more digital, more knowledge economy. And as we move forward on that, we also have to recognize, well, as Canada, we're always going to have lots of natural resources. It's just layering those natural resources into our own supply chains, recognizing, for example, that the critical minerals in the production of high-tech goods from cleaner aluminum than anyone else in the world, or cobalt and nickel and the kinds of things that go into batteries and lithium. I mean, we have in Canada supply chains that perhaps are slightly more expensive in terms of labor costs than other parts around the world, but the reliability and the way we're developing them in more environmentally and socially conscious ways is suddenly a lot more important to people as we go through this pandemic and beyond. And I think Canada is really well positioned, both with our incredible diversity and knowledge economy and our strong foundation of natural resources and our innovation around energies. Like, there are so many exciting things that I'm looking forward to once we get through this pandemic to build Canada stronger. And I think Canadians are excited as well.
I'm going to come back to the energy question, but you came under pressure earlier in the pandemic to replace all the different support programs with a universal basic income. And you drew the line there. Why did you say no to universal basic income?
Well, first of all, the measures we're putting forward in this pandemic are designed for the pandemic. And let's not pretend that something that works right now and the measures that we have that continue to give Canadians $500 every week if they're out of work and looking for a job gives us stability. that's not a measure that we can automatically continue in a post-pandemic world. I think there are really important reflections to have on how we provide income supports and how we make sure that everyone is given opportunities. I mean, that's something we moved forward with 5 years ago with the historic Canada Child Benefit that lifted hundreds of thousands of kids out of poverty by giving guaranteed income to low-income families, for kids, for single mothers. These sorts of initiatives made a huge difference and a step towards those kinds of basic income supports. But what we're doing now shouldn't be conflated with things that we might or could do in the future. I think we have to get through this before we start designing a whole new universe of social supports.
I'm going to switch a little bit here and just ask you, one of the criticisms that's leveled against progressive politicians like you is that you overpromise and under-deliver. You came into power in 2015 with a huge mandate, but you've had political difficulties in the last year, and the last election was not an easy one. How do you reflect on that? And do you think that your supporters are disappointed? And do you think that the response to the pandemic will give them a little bit more hope in what you can deliver post-pandemic?
I think a couple of things. First of all, what we were able to do over these past 5 years, or our first 4 years, in terms of bringing in a national price on carbon pollution, which had never been done before, was a huge thing. We lifted 1 million people out of poverty, which is no small thing for a country of 37 million. We created over 1 million jobs. We saw historically positive economic growth. We saw massive investments. We made huge transformations in our relationship with Indigenous peoples and made significant improvements. But as always, there's always lots more to do. And I think people are looking forward to seeing more done, as am I. And we're always going to keep working on that. As for whether this pandemic impacts on electoral fortunes, people don't vote for you based on what you might have done for them in the past. People are always focused on the future, and that's where the building back better, that's where reflecting on how we move beyond this pandemic into a world that has learned the lessons of this pandemic and invested in better social programs and supports for everyone, better job creation for the long term, invested in a green pivot that is going to allow us to be competitive on the world stage and really move forward on fighting for better equality for everyone. These are the kinds of things that I know Canadians want, my voters and all Canadians, and these are the things that we're going to keep working on.
The energy sector in Canada is 10% of the economy, and the majority is fossil fuels. So can you explain to me how you accomplish the energy transition and reach your climate goals?
Well, first of all, Canada is a country that has over 80% green energy in terms of our electricity grid. We're massively hydro, so we're one of the cleanest producers of electricity. We phased out coal plants and phasing out coal plants across the country. So we are doing significant things. Yes, we have fossil fuel resources, and the world continues to need fossil fuels and will for a while. And what our companies have actually done has been innovating tremendously to reduce carbon emissions around that. Fossil fuels will continue to be a sore point and a point of criticism for many, many people. But we also know that the expertise Canada has in energy and the fact that it's our oil and gas companies that are making the massive amount of investments in clean technology and new solutions, we know we have to transform our energy mix. And quite frankly, Canada's energy companies are leading the way in terms of that because of positions that we've taken, because of where the world is going.
Tens of billions of dollars of planned investments in pipelines have been scrapped. That has certainly affected the way that investors look at energy projects. What's your message to investors?
Well, I mean, first of all, we understand that the way you build a pipeline or a railroad today is very different than the way you did it 100 years ago. 100 years ago, you could decree it and say this is where it's going, and it really unfortunate for anyone in the path. Now, if you want to build a big project, you need to create partnership. You need to get communities to buy in. You need to demonstrate a responsible environmental long-term view. You need to partner with indigenous peoples. That's just the way of doing things. And what we've actually done over the past years is establish a framework that allows that to move forward. We have right now an energy, a fossil fuel industry that is captive to the US market, and actually creating a pipeline that can get us out to the Pacific markets was really important. And that's why we move forward on that. But we know that fossil fuels, as important as they are now, will become less and less important as part of the energy mix of the world over the coming decades. And Canada can choose to be part of that. We're not going to flip a switch from today to tomorrow, but we are going to move in a very strong way to lead the transformation and the decarbonization of our energy around the world. Canada has, and Canadians have, the know-how and the innovation and the political will to do that. And that's what we're going to stay focused on once we get through this pandemic.
Let me ask you about China, because Canada's been caught in the tensions between the US and China. There are still 2 Canadian citizens who are detained in China following the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Do you subscribe to the idea that the relationship between China and the West can only get worse, that we are entering into a new Cold War?
I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding in terms of worldviews from the West versus China, and that's one of the challenging things that we have to work through. I mean, China saw us fulfill an extradition treaty with our closest ally, the United States, and decided that by detaining arbitrarily 2 Canadian citizens, they could put pressure on us and have us, release the Meng Wanzhou. The fact is, it has very little to do with our relationship with the United States that we're living up to our extradition treaty, and everything to do with our values and the fact that we don't believe in coercive diplomacy, and that we actually deeply believe that if you start giving in to that kind of pressure, you'll leave yourself worse off for the long term. So China continues to think that they can just put enough pressure on us and we will give in, where that's exactly the opposite of our position. It's extremely unfortunate that they've detained these 2 Michaels for 700 days now, and we're doing everything we can to try and resolve it. But we will not bend on our principles, on the rule of law, on the systems of justice that protect us all as countries around the world from this might is right that we're seeing, unfortunately, in certain corners of the world.
Now we get to the big question. You may not have heard a lot about Brexit in the last few months because of the pandemic, but I am in London and there will be an exit from the EU at the end of the year. You have said before that it should be fairly straightforward to roll over the Canada-EU trade deal to a UK-Canada agreement. What are the prospects for sealing this before the end of the year?
Well, I certainly think they're very good. I spoke with Prime Minister Johnson a few days ago and told him that we are on the edge of having an agreement. There's still a couple of little things to work out.
Days, weeks?
We should. I think we're ready to have it done before January 1st. One of the challenges is bandwidth. I mean, Canada is a country that has a free trade deal with every other. We're the only G7 nation with a free trade deal with every other G7 nation. We signed NAFTA. We signed the CPTPP. We did the CETA deal with Europe over the past 5 years. We know how to negotiate trade deals. The UK hasn't had to negotiate trade deals in the past few decades. So there is an issue of not really having the bandwidth within government to move forward on this. So
have you offered to lend them some of your trade negotiations?
Yes, we have, and we have been helpful. We have been helpful in that, and we've said that, look, we should be able to move forward on that. I know that rolling over and demonstrating free trade deals for the UK government is extremely important. Canada's a really easy one. We're there for it. We'd like to do it, so I'm very hopeful that it's going to get done. But that really is up to the UK government, because we're there for it. I just hope they can come around to it.
Prime Minister, a final question. Now that we expect President Trump to be leaving the White House, I just have to ask you, you famously had to pause for quite a long time when reporters asked you about the president's response to Black Lives Matter protests. What was going through your mind?
The President Trump remains president until January 20th, and we will continue to work with the U.S. administration on many important issues like the border issues. I look forward to working with the new administration once it comes in. And indeed, there will be some subjects, whether it's climate change, whether it's anti-Black racism and Black Lives Matter, where there will be better alignment. But my job is to work with the United States and stand up for Canadian interests, and that's what I'll always do.
I have no doubt about that. But what was going through your mind during that pause? I think a lot of people have wondered.
But that's not my job. My job is to make sure that Canadians are well served in this relationship. And that is what I have stayed focused on for 4 years, and what I am going to continue to focus on well into the future. It's not up to me to opine on American political processes or American positions. It's my job to work with our allies and partners around the world to make sure Canadians are doing well, and that's exactly what I've done.
Prime Minister, thank you for being with us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.